Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Beyond the Basic PlanIt webinar series. I'm Raya, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. In this year's webinar series, we are basically focusing on value-added planning practices and how you can get more out of your plan as you're going through your comprehensive planning process. If during this webinar you have any questions, please post them using the webinar control panel and on the right hand of your screen. We get to all of your questions at the end of the webinar. Also, attached to the control panel, we have a handout for you. That's a list of links and resources that we will be mentioning during the webinar today, so you can just download that PDF. Today's webinar is about population estimates. Population estimates look back in time to the previous year and are used to track the most current population trends in the region. We will also discuss what communities can do now to ensure an accurate count of the residents in the 2020 census. Now let me introduce you to our presenter. Matt Schroeder.
Hi, everyone.
Is a senior researcher at the Metropolitan Council. He oversees the Council's population estimates program and conducts research into various demographic and housing topics. Matt, I will turn the presentation to you now.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you all for attending today's webinar. So estimates are where we're taking our best, most educated guess at what the population is based on many different data sources. Now that we're 7 years past the 2010 census, the last complete count of the population, estimates are an increasingly important picture of where our region is today. For this webinar, I'll start by talking about some background on population estimates, what they are, why we calculate them, and what different organizations do with them. I'll then discuss the Council's estimates model, which produces estimates in 3 steps. First housing units, then households, then population. After explaining the timeline and process for commenting on the Council's estimates, I'll talk about preparations for the 2020 census and what your community can do in the coming months to make sure that your 2020 census count includes everyone. I hope that this webinar will help you understand the population estimates model that we use and how you can make sure that the estimates are as accurate as they can be. But even if you're not involved with reviewing estimates, I hope this material will help inform your comprehensive planning process. I want to start by clearing up a common misunderstanding, and that's that estimates are different from forecasts. You may have reviewed Council forecasts over the past several years. Forecasts look ahead in time. You can see our crystal ball right there. In reality, we use economic and land use modeling. But forecasts are really providing an approximation of the number of people in each community in future years. These forecasts are what need to be addressed in the various elements of your comprehensive plan. But the estimates, in contrast, are looking back in time to the previous year. So we're looking at data and approximating the number of people last year. I also want to distinguish estimates from 2 other important kinds of demographic information, the decennial census and the American Community Survey, so that we're all on the same page about exactly what estimates are and are not. First, the decennial census aims to count every single person in the country, no matter where they live, every 10 years. It doesn't have much detail on the characteristics of the population, mainly race, sex, age, and home ownership. Second, the American Community Survey, or ACS for short, gathers data from a sample of people every year. Its goal is not to find out how many people live in a given area, but to find out what kind of people live there. This is our main source of data on the characteristics of the population, so things like educational attainment, income and poverty, housing costs, disability status, veteran status, and many others. We usually talk about the ACS separately from the decennial census, but the ACS is really a spin-off from the census. It gathers the same kind of data that the decennial census used to, but it does so more frequently so that we have access to more current data. So it's really integral to the census program, used to distribute nearly $400 billion in federal funding each year. And then finally, the population estimates combine some features of both the decennial census and the ACS. Like the decennial census, their goal is to measure how many people are in a given community, and like the ACS, this is carried out every year. Obviously, it would be prohibitively expensive to count every single person every year. So the population estimates give us the best possible approximation of how many people live in a given community. It's not a certain number. That's why we call them estimates. Nobody knows exactly what the actual population is, and even if we did, it would always be fluctuating. So, in the absence of a complete count provided by the census, estimates are our best guess for a single point in time. And that single point in time is April 1st of the previous year. So last year, in 2016, we were calculating estimates for April 1st, 2015. And this year, we're working on estimates for April 1st of 2016. For the historically inclined among you, we've been doing this for our entire existence. The council was established in 1967, and it created its first set of population estimates in 1968. And in fact, we actually have documentation of estimates going all the way back to 1963 from the council's predecessor, the Twin Cities Metropolitan Planning Commission. Currently, the council's estimates are governed by Section 473.24 of state law. I won't read this material verbatim, but this webinar will cover the highlights. Most broadly, state law sets forth specific roles for different levels of government. It directs the Metropolitan Council to calculate these estimates for every community in the 7-county Twin Cities region. For every other city and township in the state, in greater Minnesota that is, the State Demographic Center calculates estimates. And then for local governments, that is cities and townships, they have their own role to play. State law establishes a period during which cities and townships can submit comments on or challenges to these estimates. I'll say more about that later in today's webinar. So our estimates, along with the State Demographic Center's estimates for greater Minnesota, are official for state government purposes, such as local government aid and street aid from MnDOT. In our work, we've also heard of other uses by local governments, including financial planning, determining the allowable number of liquor licenses in a certain community, and obtaining population figures when ordering new road signs. We here at the Metropolitan Council also use the estimates to track growth and development, and that's because they're a nice, intuitively understandable way to think about growth and development. So we often talk about the number of new residential units added, or how housing preferences are shifting towards central locations with good transit accessibility, or about how local policies interact with the housing market to drive development. Population estimates are a more concrete way to understand the intersection of all these things: local policies, household choices, the housing market, and residential development. They also help point to where additional regional investments may be needed in the future. And finally, they serve as a reality check on our demographic forecasts. And I'll say more about that too toward the end of today's webinar. I want to mention too that we use the estimates to develop small area estimates. So these are areas smaller than cities and townships, like transportation analysis zones, or TAZs, census tracts, transitway station areas, and a host of other geographies like wards or school districts or any combination of the above. These estimates are designed to roll up to the estimates for cities and townships so that all of the numbers remain consistent across the different geographic levels. Our transportation planners use these small area estimates in their models, but they've also helped us, the small area estimates that is, have helped us provide additional information to communities upon request. So for example, each year the Brooklyn Park Charter Commission meets to consider whether ward boundaries need to be redrawn given recent population shifts. Earlier this year, one of their planners contacted us about this process, and our small area estimates helped us provide them with a basic consistency check of their traditional method. So that's some detail about why we calculate estimates and what different organizations use them for. And now I'll talk about how we calculate them, starting with 4 different priorities that we try hard to balance. The first is a valid framework that produces reliable results. So we want a tried and true method of building our estimates, so that we can rely on the accumulated wisdom of others. The second is accuracy. We want to use the best available evidence that reflects reality as closely as possible. We know that the estimates can be only as accurate as the inputs that they come from. The third is transparency. We want communities to be able to understand how their estimates are created and to understand the main levers that cause their estimate to increase or decrease. And finally, there's fairness. Because these estimates do have some consequences for communities, we want to make sure that the playing field is level for everyone. Despite our best efforts, these priorities do sometimes conflict. For example, maximizing accuracy requires balancing the reliability of different data sources, which in turn sometimes requires calculations that aren't transparent or easily understandable to everyone. And another example of this is that sometimes communities may know that the 2010 census missed some of their housing units, but because it's too late to change that, we need to rely on the 2010 count to maintain a fair standard for all communities, even if it may sacrifice a little bit of accuracy. But overall, we try to do the best job we can on all four of these. Before I begin digging into the details of the model, I wanted to discuss some key terms so that we're all on the same page about what exactly we at the Council are trying to estimate. First, housing units are places where one or more people can live. So they're not the same as buildings. A single-family detached home has 1 unit, a duplex has 2 units, and large apartment or condo buildings can have hundreds of units in them. A household, in contrast, is a person or group of people living in a housing unit. So not all housing units have people living in them. Some of them are vacant. The occupied ones have households. So by definition, the number of households is the same as the number of occupied housing units. And even the word population needs some elaboration. Most people in our region live in households, so they occupy housing units that they either own or rent. But about 60,000 people in our region live in what the Census Bureau calls group quarters facilities. These are places like nursing homes or college dormitories. And this matters because we calculate our estimates differently for people in households versus people in group quarters. Most of what I'll be talking about today involves estimating the population in households. The population in group quarters is an extra step that I'll explain at the end. So when we're going through the model on the following slides, just remember that we're talking about people in households. Like most agencies that estimate the population for cities and townships, the Council uses what's called the housing stock method. It's based on the idea that housing units don't move around like people do, so they're easier to track. And we can use what we know about different kinds of housing units to arrive at population figures. And in this process, we ask 3 questions. First, how many housing units does each community have? Second, how many households live in these housing units? We saw on the previous slide that households are equivalent to occupied housing units, so this is the same as asking how many of these housing units are occupied. Third and finally, how many people live in these households? So the big takeaway here is that populations grow when communities add housing units, when more of those housing units are occupied, and when those occupied housing units have more people living in them. And here's how this works. I'll start with a big picture overview and then talk about these different questions on the following slides. So again, we're starting with how many housing units there are in each community. To do that, we start with the number of housing units counted by the Census Bureau in the 2010 census. We then look at changes to the housing stock since 2010, like building permits and demolitions. And that gets us to the number of housing units in the previous year. Once we have housing units, we can estimate the number of households. To do that, we multiply the number of housing units by the occupancy rate. And that's because households are just occupied housing units. And finally, once we have the number of households, we can estimate the number of people in those households. To do that, we take the number of households and multiply it by the average household size, also known as the persons per household. I'll talk more about each of these components in just a bit, but for now I do want to mention that I've made these different colors to distinguish what we know from what we're estimating. The 2010 housing units is in green. It comes from the 2010 census, which is basically a complete count. The changes to housing stock since 2010 are reported to us annually by local governments, so those are basically knowable as well. Those are in green as well. But the occupancy rate and average household size, though, are in blue because they require some additional work. Those come primarily from the American Community Survey, which is a sample, so we do some additional work to reconcile those with other data sources, which I'll describe in a little bit. We're doing these calculations separately for each of these 6 different types of housing: single-family detached units, townhomes, also known as single-family attached units, duplex, triplex, quadplex units, multifamily units, that is units in buildings with 5 or more units in it, manufactured homes, and then kind of a catch-all other category that's mostly houseboats or vehicles used as shelter. I mention this because in most communities, single-family homes, for example, are more likely to be occupied than multifamily apartments, and they tend to have higher average household sizes. So we can take advantage of that detailed data on housing type to get more accurate estimates. So starting with how we estimate housing units. We start with that 2010 census count of housing units because that's as close to reality as we're likely to get. It has some minor shortcomings that I'll talk more about later, but it's still the most accurate data we can get for all communities in the region. And then we incorporate changes to the housing stock since 2010. Most of these changes come from residential construction, and this data is submitted to us annually by local governments as part of our annual survey of residential construction. So this includes new construction, conversions from non-residential uses to residential units, demolitions, and other kinds of changes that are more rare. We also look at annexations, which lately has been generally cities annexing parts of surrounding townships. And then we also survey every manufactured housing park in the region every year to get the count of total homes and occupied homes. And when we're doing this, it's important to remember that each year's estimates are for April 1st of the previous year. And we'll talk about how that works because each year's estimates don't include the most recent permits. So last year in 2016, the first half of 2016, we were estimating the population as of April 1st, 2015, the green X there. This year in 2017, we're calculating estimates for April 1st of 2016. And next year, in 2018, we'll be calculating the estimates for April 1st of 2017, just a few weeks ago. In each of these estimate cycles, we're including permits from 2010 through the year before the estimate, the years in the blue bars here. So for the 2015 estimates at the bottom, we looked at permits from 2010 through 2014. For the 2016 estimates that we'll release in a few weeks, we're looking at permits from 2010 through 2015. And next year, we'll be looking at permits from 2010 through 2016. So in sum, units permitted in these years affect the estimates for April 1st of this year, which are developed the following year. And I mention this because it tends to cause a lot of confusion. We recently surveyed communities about their permits issued in 2016, but those permits won't count toward any estimates until next year's estimate for April 1st of 2017. So this is something to remember if you're reviewing estimates this year. Putting all those pieces together, here's how that works in practice. Here's a city that had 4,200 housing units in the 2010 census at the bottom of column A there. Let's say that 2,700 of them were single-family detached. Let's also say that this city saw 350 more single-family detached units permitted and built in the 2010 to 2015 period, as column B shows. And at the same time in column C, you can see that this city had a net loss of 50 single-family detached units aside from new construction. So perhaps these were torn down to build larger homes or simply demolished and not replaced. But when we add those three up, columns A, B, and C, we get to 3,000 estimated single-family detached units in this city in 2016. And it works the same way for single-family attached units or townhomes, duplex, triplex, quadplex units, and multifamily units. I want to mention that for manufactured homes, we're not looking directly at changes. Rather, we're just taking the most recent numbers reported by the park managers, which in this case would be 300. For those other units, that catch-all other category, we're simply taking the number reported in the most recent American Community Survey estimates. And adding all of those up at the bottom of column D, we get 5,000 total housing units in this community. And now that we have housing units, we can multiply by occupancy rates to get the number of households. The occupancy rates for manufactured homes come from our annual survey. For all other housing types, they come from the American Community Survey. We rely on that ACS data because they have the advantage of being specific to each community and housing type, but they do have a couple shortcomings. First, they're averaged over a 5-year period, so they don't reflect the latest market conditions. Our vacancy rates, you may have heard, are some of the lowest they've been, historically speaking, which means that our occupancy rates are some of the highest that they've been. So we want our estimates to reflect that. We do that by looking at other data sources. Those are one-year ACS estimates, estimates from the current population survey's housing vacancy survey, Marquette Advisors reports, trends in U.S. Postal Service data, and then using all that, we adjust the occupancy rates in the 5-year ACS estimates to better reflect the trends between the 2011 to 2015 period where the ACS data are from and the time of the estimate, which is 2016. And the second shortcoming is that the ACS occupancy rates are based on a sample of about 2% of housing units in the region each year. That means that they're subject to sampling error, especially in smaller communities. The occupancy rate coming from the ACS is our best guess based on the sample, but the actual occupancy rate could be higher or lower than that. So consequently, we adjust them to be more consistent with other data sources that aren't as detailed as the ACS, but that do include all housing units. So those are the 2010 census and data from the U.S. Postal Service. So those are two ways that we're still wanting to take advantage of the geographic specificity and the housing type specificity of the ACS data, but making sure that the results coming out of those align with other data sources that don't depend on a sample. Then to calculate the number of households, we apply those estimated occupancy rates to the number of housing units we estimated before, and the result is the number of households. So let's say that the ACS data, adjusted as I just described, provide an estimated occupancy rate of 98% for single-family detached units in this community. If we multiply those 3,000 units by that occupancy rate, we get 2,940 estimated households in single-family detached units. Repeating for the other housing types and then adding up the results yields 4,850 total households in the community. And you can see here how the detail on housing types helps the estimates be more precise. We can take advantage of that detailed data on housing type and the different occupancy rates associated with them to get a better picture of the overall occupancy rate. So the majority of units in this community are single-family units, which tend to have pretty high occupancy rates. So that gets us to a relatively high overall occupancy rate, which we get by dividing the number of households by the number of housing units, a 97% occupancy rate, for example, in this example, which is equivalent to a 3% vacancy rate. And that occupancy rate is pretty high relative to the region, where occupancy rates have been between about 95 and 96% as estimated for the past few years, which itself is pretty high, historically speaking. And finally, the third step is to move from households to people living in households. We do this by multiplying households by the average household size. Data for this comes from the Manufactured Housing Park Survey and the American Community Survey, just like with occupancy rates. And also as with occupancy rates, the ACS data do have that advantage of being specific to each community and housing type, but they also have shortcomings that we try to compensate for. And that first one we've seen before. Sampling error can be a consideration, so we adjust them to reconcile them with the 2010 census. Second, those resulting estimates are based on just one method of estimation, the housing stock method. But there's another primary method of population estimates out there that works well for larger areas than cities and townships, and that's to look at the three components of population change: births, deaths, and migration. And that's what the Census Bureau does for its county level estimates. So we also adjust our average household size estimates to reconcile them with the Census Bureau's annual county level estimates. And that way we still can retain that local detail based on housing stock, but we can also take advantage of the totals coming from that other tried and true estimation method. So again, we're still trying to take advantage of the geographic and housing type specificity of the ACS, but trying to reconcile them with other data sources. And then finally, to calculate the number of people in households, we apply those average household sizes as estimated to the number of households that we looked at before, and the result is the population in households. So again, taking single-family detached units as an example, let's say the ACS data, adjusted as I just described, provide an average household size of 3 persons for every single-family detached household. If we multiply those 2,940 households by that average household size, we get to 8,820 people in single-family detached units. Repeating for the other housing types, then adding up the results, gets us to 13,504 people in households in this community. And again, you can see how this detail helps the estimates be more refined. Again, the majority of units in this community are single-family detached, which tend to have higher average household sizes. So that kind of brings up the overall average household size of the community, which we get by dividing the 13,504 people in households by the 4,850 households to 2.78 persons per household on average, which is higher than the regional average household size of about 2.5 currently, but it's still lower than they have been in the past. So in 1970, soon after the council was formed, the average household size for the region was 3.19. So on average, households are a lot smaller than they used to be. And that's the essence of the council's housing stock model, estimating housing units by adding the changes since 2010 to the base count from the 2010 census, then multiplying the results by the occupancy rates to estimate households, then multiplying those by the average household sizes to estimate people in households. And that gets us to the population in households. And as I mentioned earlier, there's that other component of total population, the group quarters population. So to get to the total population, we need to estimate those people as well. So these facilities, these group quarters facilities, some of these are institutions that the residents don't often leave, like correctional facilities or nursing homes. And others are places like group homes and college dormitories. But either way, these are places that aren't really part of the housing market, and so they don't have the occupancy rates and the average household sizes that we typically look to in the census data. So instead, we count them directly. Each year, we survey facilities with 10 or more residents, and then we also consult lists of licensed facilities from the Department of Human Services. We add all those facility counts up within the communities, add those to the population in households, and then get to the total population. And I want to talk a little bit about different kinds of senior housing, since it's there that the distinction between housing units and group quarters can get kind of blurry. The rule of thumb is generally that if residents can come and go as they please, and if they have some privacy in the unit, it's classified as a housing unit in a multifamily building. So this would be the case for independent living and assisted living units. If the residents can't really come and go as they please and don't have a lot of privacy, it's classified as group quarters, and that would be the case for units like nursing home and memory care units. Excuse me. You may be familiar with this way of thinking in your own work from density calculations. I want to switch gears now and talk about the timeline and process for commenting on or challenging the estimates. I explained toward the beginning of the webinar that this is an important role that local governments can play. State law has instituted June 1st as the date by which we have to convey the preliminary estimates to communities. In practice, we usually do this by mid-May. So for example, this year we're planning, I hope, well, definitely planning, but I hope we can actually fulfill this goal of mailing by May 16th. And in that communication is three things: a letter communicating the preliminary estimate and how to respond, an overview of the calculations, and a detailed report showing the key inputs and calculations. We send these to the highest elected official and the highest appointed official in each local unit of government. State law also specifies June 24th as the deadline for communities to submit comments or challenges if they choose to. What this means in practice is that communities usually have about 5 or 6 weeks to comment in writing. And then after that deadline, we at the council take a few weeks to compile all the numbers and compile the results, and then we certify those to the state by July 15th. If you're reviewing estimates, it's helpful to keep a few things in mind. First, we refine our data and methods every year, and we don't go back and revise the estimates from previous years that communities have already reviewed. So, for that reason, the estimates from 2 different years aren't necessarily comparable. Second, preliminary estimates from 1 year aren't necessarily comparable to final estimates from the year before. The final estimates from the year before may have reflected a one-time adjustment during that comment period to deal with a quirk of the data. So we're always starting fresh each year from the newest data and methods. And here are a few examples of those newer data and methods. In the past year, we've overhauled our group quarters data. We've also uncovered some units permitted between 2010 and 2014 that we hadn't had in our data, so updating that as well. And then finally, we've identified some additional units that were actually permitted before 2010, but were also not included in the 2010 census count. So those hadn't made it into our estimates before because they hadn't made it into the 2010 census or the changes since 2010. So these are a few examples of the changes that can make it difficult to compare directly the 2016 estimates to previous years of estimates. So some questions to think about as you're deciding whether to submit comments and then in writing your comments. First, I want to emphasize that local data is a really important part of our estimates, and I'd really appreciate anything that communities can do to improve the accuracy of our inputs. So comments that typically lead to changes from the preliminary estimate to the final estimate have often been about the accuracy of our building permit data. So whether our estimates reflect all the building permits and other housing stock changes that you and your community know about, since that affects the number of housing units. Second, some communities have utilities data that can shed light on occupancy rates or trends in occupancy rates. And then I'm also interested in hearing whether occupancy rates and average household sizes for the different housing types in your community seem reasonable. So not the overall occupancy rate and average household sizes, but the type-specific ones that we're estimating. And that's because sometimes, despite all that we do to address the uncertainty in ACS estimates, there's a type of housing that just isn't very common in a community, and the occupancy rate or average household size for that housing type can still be a little off. So any perspective you can shed on that would be really helpful too. So after you review the preliminary estimates with those considerations in mind, here's what happens next if you choose to submit a comment. I mentioned before that our estimates program attempts to balance 4 priorities: a valid framework, accurate inputs, a transparent process, and an even playing field. We do that during the comment and challenge period as well. And so toward those ends, we commit to all of the following. We'll answer all of your questions. We'll explain all of our reasoning. We'll consult any other available data sources that may apply to your community. And we will use the same standard for your community as we would for any other when reviewing estimates. And for the same reason, we can't commit always to adjusting estimates in any certain way. We certainly want to address concerns and take advantage of local knowledge, and we also want to be true to what the various data sources tell us. And as I mentioned before, the fact that we've made adjustments in the past doesn't necessarily argue for a similar adjustment in the present, because each year, again, we're starting fresh with that new set of data and methods. If your community and the Met Council can't agree on the population estimate, state law provides for a remedy. Your community can ask the Census Bureau to conduct a special census. And for details, you can see the relevant section of state law or the Census Bureau's website, which I linked here. To my knowledge, we haven't had a community do this before. There is a cost associated with this that the community has to pay for. But I did want to mention it here because of some changes unique to this year. This year, the Census Bureau has to receive requests for special censuses by June 15th. That's actually earlier than our own deadline to comment on the estimates, which is June 24th. So I wanted to be sure to mention that here. That's because they're not going to consider any requests after that date because they need to focus on preparing for the 2020 census. So that may be a reason to submit comments earlier rather than later in the comment period. I want to mention too that the Census Bureau also produces their own estimates for cities and townships. And sometimes in some communities, those estimates can be a little different. So for that reason, I want to explain, provide some answers to questions that communities sometimes have about why our estimates differ from Census Bureau estimates for cities and townships. First, they come from different time periods. Our estimates are for April 1st. The Census Bureau's are for July 1st of any given year. Second, the Census Bureau's data don't include some important changes to housing stock, like conversions and as well as some new construction of large apartment complexes. And third, we try to make our occupancy rate and average household size multipliers reflect the most recent housing stock and data. The Census Bureau just uses the multipliers from the 2010 census. And then finally, we're surveying our group quarters facilities every year. In contrast, the Census Bureau looks only at a small group of facilities, looks at the trend in those, and then applies that trend to the 2010 group quarters population. And when I'm talking about this, my intent here is not to knock the Census Bureau's estimates as way off base or anything like that. It's simply to explain why for some communities our estimates can differ from the Census Bureau's. So they need to use a method that works for every single community in the country, no matter how large or how small it is. And we at the Council are able to use a method that we think works better for every place in the region. Looking ahead now, I want to offer some considerations for the future, given that the 2020 census is now less than 3 years away. As we've seen, the 2010 housing unit count is the foundation of all the estimates since then, from 2011 to 2019. And so to make your community's estimates after 2020 more accurate, it's extremely important to make sure that all of your housing units get counted in the 2020 census. And there are benefits in addition to accuracy. The 2020 census influences where state and federal funding go, and it also affects congressional apportionment and legislative redistricting. You may have seen the article in last Sunday's Star Tribune about the risk that Minnesota faces of losing a congressional seat after the 2020 census in the next round of apportionment. So that's another reason, an important reason, to make sure that the Census Bureau can count everybody. I've heard from a couple of communities during the past couple of years that know that they had more housing units in 2010 than were counted in the 2010 census. The Census Bureau didn't make those sorts of revisions following the 2010 census, and they've already said that if they don't count it on Census Day, it's not going to get counted. They need to finalize the population by December 31st of 2020 to apportion congressional seats. So it's absolutely critical to make sure that the Census Bureau knows about all the units in your community before that. And here's one way of doing that. There's a program about to kick off called the Local Update of Census Addresses, or LUCA for short. And the goal is to make sure that the Census Bureau's address list includes every single housing unit in the country so that they can be included in the 2020 census. Looking ahead a bit, the invitation to participate will go out to the highest elected official in every community this July. And then following some training workshops this fall, most of the work will happen this coming winter and spring. But in the next month is kind of an important first step when the Census Bureau will be hosting some informational webinars. If you're interested in those, you can email me at matt.schroeder@met.state.mn.us for the dates and times of those webinars. And I want to highlight this because our preliminary examinations of the Census Bureau's data show that a wide variety of communities from all across the region can benefit from this process. Those include Arden Hills, Bloomington, Burnsville, Maple Grove, Minneapolis, Plymouth, Prior Lake, Ramsey, St. Paul, Wayzata, and Woodbury, among others. So I bring this up because we at the Met Council really want to see an accurate 2020 census as well. So given how important this process is, I encourage everyone to participate. Switching gears a bit, I mentioned before that estimates are a reality check on our demographic forecasts. And that's because our forecasts are developed in a totally separate modeling process and are independent of the estimates in previous growth trends. So the estimates and the growth trends coming from them really do shed light on how those independent forecasts are looking after 5 years from 2010. And here's one way to think about that. The 2010 census counted about 21,000 households in this community, while the 2015 estimate developed last year was at about 23,100 households. The dotted gray line shows the number of households in future years just extrapolating from only those 5 years of growth. And you can see that it goes right through the forecasted number of households for 2020, 2030, and 2040. And those forecasts come from several years ago, I should say. So this is an example of a community where the forecasts seem basically realistic based on the past 5 years of growth. Here, on the other hand, is an example of a community where the forecasts seem a bit too low based on the past 5 years of growth. So this community's 2015 estimate of 10,923 households was only a little bit under its 2020 forecast of 11,000 households. This community's trajectory is a lot steeper than the forecasts imply. If your estimates and forecasts look like this, it may be worth considering an upward revision to your forecasts. I say considering because your knowledge of the available land supply and market conditions may suggest that the total growth between 2010 and 2040 will still be the same. More of it may simply be happening in this decade rather than in subsequent decades. And finally, here's an example of a community where the forecasts seem too high based on the past 5 years of growth. If your estimates and forecasts look like this, it may be worth considering a downward revision to your forecasts. And again, I want to emphasize that considering. Growth isn't always linear, and you may know of major developments opening up in the next few years that would get your community to the 2020 forecast. But either way, forecast changes are a very iterative process that require council approval. And I want to mention that if you'd like more context on that, you can see the archived PlanIt webinar entitled Comprehensive Plan Kickoff, or the fact sheet entitled How to Request a Forecast Change. And both of those are linked on the resource sheet that Raya mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. And finally, you may be wondering, how do I get the 2010 census? and the estimates and the forecasts in the same place. Well, we have that in our community profiles, which is a handy tool that we like to publicize every chance we get. So if you go to that site at metrocouncil.org/data, click on Community Profiles, select your community from the resulting map or list, and then go to the People tab, you'll find this chart, or a chart that looks like this. This is actually for the Twin Cities region, the 7-county region, but we have them for every single city and township. And you can also find many more kinds of information for your community, demographics, housing, employment, and more. So that's a great resource, also linked on the resource sheet, as is the Mapping Resources and Data Finding tutorial available on the PlanIt site. So with that, I will turn it back to Raya.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. I just have a few things to mention before we move on to the questions. On this page, you'll see a few of the links that were mentioned during this webinar, and you can just click on them directly. The PlanIt page is where we have the most current information on upcoming events, as well as some of the past events, like the ones that Matt mentioned. You can use the population estimates page of the council for additional information on today's topic, and also the census page to learn more about LUCA. So all of these links, again, are on the handout that's attached to this webinar, so you can download that and use it. Now, we have time to answer a few questions before we end this webinar. Sorry, just let me get my surrounding. Are the small area estimates you mentioned available to the public?
Yes, they are. We publish the estimates for transitway station areas on our data download page, and we also publish the TAZ estimates on the Minnesota Geospatial Commons. We can also make other estimates available by request if you email us at research@metc.state.mn.us. I should mention too that the TAZ estimates on the Geospatial Commons are for 2014. We have more recent estimates available as well for 2015, and you can email us for those as well.
Thank you. So someone has asked about the 2016 estimates. Can you repeat again when the 2016 population estimates will be made public?
Yes, we hope to mail out the preliminary estimates on May 16th, on or before May 16th. We, at that time, will also put those on our website, and then the final estimates that have been reviewed by communities and certified to the state will be available on our website on July 15th.
Thank you. You mentioned an overhaul in the group quarters data in the past year. Can you provide a little more background on that?
Sure. We do our best to keep a list of all the group quarters facilities in the region, based primarily on looking at the facilities from the 2010 census and updating as necessary. In the past year, we have gone through that list. We have culled out some duplicate facilities. Sometimes facilities have a name change, and it's despite our best efforts, it's difficult to track the same facilities over time. So we've kind of gone through them and attempted to refine that data, both the counts from that data and to deal with different kinds of changes in how the data was sent to us. So for most communities, those changes would be very small. But if you have any questions as you're reviewing estimates, I'd be happy to answer them.
In my past correspondence about the estimates, you've indicated that only a certain percentage of permits from the most recent year are counted towards the estimates. Can you say more about that?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that. That's a frequent question that I get during the review period. For permits issued in the most recent year, you are correct that so in this year we are looking at permits from 2010 through 2015, but we also recognize that not all units permitted in 2015 will actually have been built and completed and ready for occupancy by April 1st of 2016. So we're assuming that 95% of single-family detached units are completed, 90% of townhomes and duplex units are completed, and 85% of multifamily units are completed. We know that projects run into delays for construction or finance reasons, but if you know that all the units permitted in your community in 2015 were actually ready for occupancy by April 1st of 2016, that's a change that we're always happy to make during the comment period.
Thank you. What is the source of new construction and demolitions?
The new construction data comes from the building permit data submitted to us every year by communities as part of our residential construction survey. And it's the same for other changes like demolitions. So that survey went out, I believe, several weeks ago. I'm not sure I can keep track of all the different deadlines, but if your community hasn't responded to that survey, I would encourage you to do so if you can, since that will really help with the estimates for next year.
Thank you. Could you explain or provide source for more information on economic cycle adjustments for determining household numbers?
Sure, that's a great question. As I said, we do that to reconcile the ACS data, which for this year's estimates will come from the 2011 to 2015 5-year average with the time of the estimate, which is for 2016. So one way we do that is by looking at occupancy rates in the 2011 to 2015 ACS for the whole region compared to the occupancy rates for each housing type in the 2015 one-year ACS. So that's one trend that we can take care of, just the differing time period. And then after we've done that, we can kind of look at the trend between 2015, that single year, and 2016. And to do that, we look at trends in U.S. Postal Service data. We look at Marquette Advisors reports on vacancy rates among large apartment complexes. We look at the current population survey, housing vacancy survey data for the metro as a whole. So again, this economic cycle adjustment is for the region as a whole. We can't get it specific to any particular community, but it is something that we do so that the occupancy rates for the region as a whole will look more like the current market.
Perfect. I understand that estimates are different from forecasts, but does the council use the estimates to inform their forecasts?
No, we don't. The council's forecasts are developed independently of estimates and those recent growth trends. What we do with forecasts, I'll just talk about this really briefly, is we use a regional economic model to forecast the regional population. So that looks at our economic competitiveness relative to other regions. The more jobs we have, the more people move here from elsewhere, and that's on top of natural increase from the fact that more people are being born than are dying. So after we get that regional population, we then use a land use and transportation model that accounts for land supply, housing demand, to forecast local populations. Again, if you'd like more information on that, we have a very detailed forecasts page on our website. And there's also a webinar from last May, I believe, called the Comprehensive Plan Kickoff that you can find archived on the PlanIt page under past events.
Thank you. This may be the last question we have time for, but we'll see. What can local planners do to further help the Metropolitan Council with these estimates?
I really appreciate the question. Thank you for the offer. I would say that there are 3 main opportunities planners have to provide input on the estimates. The first, as I mentioned before, is our annual survey of residential and non-residential construction. And that's because getting accurate counts of permits of each type is really important in our estimates process. But we recognize that it's not always planners who respond to the survey, though. Sometimes in larger communities, it's whole other departments. The second is the comment period for the estimates, if they're passed down to you from the city manager or administrator. So for example, examples that I can think of from past comment periods include both revisions to that building permit data to reflect units that were increased relative to what was in the permit or not built. So updated information on what's actually been built. I guess that's kind of a big thing, as well as just kind of a review based on your knowledge of your community of the different data inputs. And then finally, there's I guess more irregular but still important things like the LUCA program that I mentioned, or responding to just kind of one-off questions that do build on that local knowledge that planners have. So last week, for example, I contacted a couple of planners about double-checking some numbers from our manufactured home park survey that looked a little odd relative to the trends from previous years. So that was really helpful. So those are, I guess, three things I can think of. One, the building permit survey, if that's part of your responsibilities. Two, the comment period. And then third, just anything you can offer from questions. And as always, if you have other ideas, please feel free to email me.
Okay. I have one other question that I hope that we can quickly answer. We have a lot more, but let's see. If you can keep it short. How can you reconcile discrepancies in school population forecasting done by schools with other population forecasting?
That is an excellent question, and one that unfortunately requires much more time than we probably have. I don't work as much on the forecasting side of things, so I'm only kind of remotely familiar with how school district forecasts done by others work. I know that our forecasters have built school district forecasts from our TAZ forecasts that planners have reviewed, and that can kind of be rolled up to school districts. But generally, they come from different data sources, use different assumptions. That is all I can offer at the moment, but our contact information is available. So if you have further questions about that, you can always email research@metc.state.mn.us.
Thank you, Matt. I will just add a couple of things to this last question. Regarding school forecasting, and that's something I learned at our last webinar, which was on school districts. Their forecasting is done differently than us. It's done by school districts themselves. There are different methods, different people involved in the forecasting. But also the other thing that I was going to say is that we will be providing this Q&A document with the questions that we didn't get to, and also additional answer to questions like the last one. So we'll provide as much detail as possible on this, so please look out for that. We will be posting it in the next week. And you saw Matt's email address, so if you have any questions, he would be happy to answer directly, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so just before we leave, I have a couple of things to add. This webinar provides 1 CM credit for the people who want to record it as one of their AICP credits. So you can just search it under PlanIt on the APA website, or the code for it is 9119514. Our next PlanIt event is in fact next week. It might actually be full. It's the second workshop added for interactive community engagement with James Rojas, and we added that because it was so popular. We also have another workshop coming up in June, on June 22nd, on redevelopment. That workshop is designed to facilitate peer-to-peer discussions on a variety of redevelopment topics. Registration for the redevelopment workshop isn't open yet, but for everything else, including the webinar coming up in July, you can register for them right now on the PlanIt page of the handbook. And as you're exiting the webinar, there will be a very quick 5-question survey. If you can just spend a few seconds and fill that out and help us with that, that will be great. We will be posting the video for this webinar, including the PowerPoint slides and a detailed Q&A document, again, including those questions that we didn't get to and additional answer to some of the questions that we just need a little more research on during the next week, within next week. And please do feel free to contact us with any questions and comments. And thank you for joining us today.